to try to take advantage of, they thought they could override it, that when the working class is sufficiently united and determined, nothing can beat it. That, I think, was what Saltley demonstrated, and the measure of that in the subsequent decades of the failure to maintain that degree of unity is, I think, a measure of the degree to which neoliberalism became increasingly effective. But in the 1970s, perhaps as the Queen might say, it was a decennium horribilis, not for the working class, but for the ruling class, who just could not hold sway. No wonder they talked of tin pot armies and coups and frothed at the mouth about revolutionary Marxists taking over this or that or the other. The ruling class certainly had an uncomfortable time of it during the 1970s, I think. But anybody who was alive and well in that period, who could not remember, if you were on a picket line, the loud cry, "The miners are coming," the electric atmosphere that would emerge when you knew that there was going to be a solidarity expression on the picket line from that most powerful of section of trade unionists. And when their banner appeared in front of you on the picket line, you knew you were going to win. It was, as they say, bliss to be young in those days. I recall rather unashamedly frightening a managing director as a young full-time trade unionist, the MD of an oil refinery in Belper, who was a Michael Edwards lookalike in every sense of the word. That's the director of British Leyland, who took on Derek Robinson subsequently, by saying to him that with only a nip down the road to a telephone box, we didn't have mobiles in those days, so ancient were we, that I could make sure the front gates would be clogged with pickets from up north, and to see his resolve crumble instantly and find a solution to the dispute was quite satisfying. Of course it was a fib, but you know, it was a fib that worked. All's fair in love, war and class struggle. But it's a long time since we've seen such expressions of class solidarity. I am enlivened to read and hear of lorry drivers turning round on picket lines in the north west this year in Unite disputes. And of course the defeatist stance of the Kinnocks and the Blairs of the world that followed showed that replacing class struggle with consensus politics drew us into unprotected areas of mass extinction. That's what took place. The salami tactics that the Tories used of cutting off one section of workers, then another section, then another section, and the absence of solidarity between workers over that period was indeed the way in which neoliberalism was introduced. But in 1972, I was very young, but I mean, you know, a bit of a history buff, I could see already that the advances that had taken place in the 1950s and 60s by communists and left-wingers in the wider labour movement, affecting unions like the miners, like what would become UCAT, the AEU and the TGWU, which are now both in the same Unite union. That was the basis from which the victory of Saltley became possible. Underpinning all of that was the shop stewards movement in the giant factories of Birmingham. Now, of course, all more or less long gone, not much left. I would argue that the role of the Communist Party from the 1930s to the 1970s in building factory organisation, providing political education and winning key positions in the trade union movement was critical to the wider success of the working class before Thatcherism. It's the issue of how we responded to that challenge that saw the onset of neoliberal success subsequently, which destroyed not only, I think, Communist Party, but also the labour movement's ability to be able to respond effectively for a very, very long time. And the transformation of the trade union movement into a fighting force was already there in 1972. I spent a lot of my time in the Star Club in Birmingham, owned by the Communist Party, which was the centre of all of this. And it just so happened that the party's Midlands District Secretary, Frank Waters, who's been mentioned, it would be remiss of us not to say something, especially as he's my deceased father-in-law. At the time of Saltley, he was just 51 years of age. I always said he was sorcerer to my role as magician's apprentice. I'm not quite sure if I've learned all the tricks yet, but obviously I've been trying. Frank was a communist all his days until he died in 2002, and he was one of those giants of the working class movement who carved out for my party a major role in the trade union movement. Himself a miner from Lanarkshire until an injury propelled him out of the pits, and Harry Pollitt, the communist leader, sent him to Yorkshire to assist in changing the politics of that coalfield, working with many, many, many others. I mean, just one measure of his success that always intrigued me was how they turned a small village called Armthorpe into virtually a red village. You know, people have heard, I think, of Moscow, Little Moscows before, but a village that elected communist councillors. But when he relocated in 1968 in Birmingham, it was deliberately, he was deliberately sent here as a measure to help cement the rising struggle of trade unions against the potential for anti-trade union legislation. And the Star Club not only became a successful conference, folk and reggae centre and music centre, but it was also a force for left unity. And I'm sure Arthur will know better than me the importance of being able to put up pickets, hoist them and so on. So it became actually a very significant part of the activity. I mean, I was much more involved in those days in cleaning the morning the Star Club and serving behind its bar than leading workers in struggle. It was very, in my defence, I was very, very, very young. But I do recall the fun of the unlimited supply of steak pies, which the Transport and General Workers Union paid for, which, as I recall, ended up as missiles which many scab lorry drivers had to negotiate during their attempts to penetrate Saltley Gate. The friendly baker with a small family business who was a member of the party, his kids were all in the Young Communist League, and we were organising that, churning out those pies, which became a staple in the 1970s, star steak pies. But more seriously, with industry grinding to a halt and an unclogged situation down there, it was, for me, inspiring to see the 535 TGWU road haulage branch. And, you know, 10 years or so later, 12 years later, when I was a full-time official covering Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, I had quite a time trying to restrain lorry drivers from crossing picket lines there. But here in Birmingham, it was very effective. And I think an enormous number of political lessons were created, building on class consciousness, perhaps even greater political consciousness emerging out of that experience, that period. But all of this was rooted in a history of trade union organisation in mass factories, dating really from the Second World War onwards. But a decisive turn in industrial relations in the Midlands was most certainly when what Engels called the sleeping giant of the British working class managed to conclude an incredible victory in a major dispute in 1956 involving the British Leyland Motor Combine Committee, where the entire region was closed over the issue of redundancies or dismissals. It was much the same, really. When the industry was still very seasonal and high purchase terms had been toughened as a result of the Suez crisis, the company decided to lay off thousands and thousands of workers, and the response was a mass response. And that interconnection and the organisation of the Shop Stewards Committee was the basis for probably the next 20-odd years. Significant working class power in the region. And it's that lesson that needs to be maintained in the present period, perhaps in a different way. Industry is different, work is different now. We need to organise it in a different way. But the interconnections that were rooted in the strike of the Lucas Girls in 1932 in Birmingham, when Jessie Eden, not a character in a TV soap opera, but a real person who I met and knew, led 10,000 young women out on strike when no union would let them join, and brought mass trades unionism to women and young people in the factories of the Midlands. And she led the incredible rent strike of 1939, when 45,000 tenants refused to pay rents in a months-long strike against the Tory council that wanted to introduce a means-tested arrangement and variable rents according to your level of income, where they would identify each person in the house and how much they had. They wouldn't, needless to say. These incredible struggles were enormous. And of course, in 1972, I was very young. I was only 21, which makes me quite young now still, I think. I only remember some of these figures as distant, towering giants of enormous ability, although Arthur Harper would always buy me a pint in the Star Club. But just remembering a couple of them, in terms of why it's so important that this mural project actually does succeed. Alan Law, the leader of the West Midlands lorry drivers, for most of the period, 20, 30 years from 1950, was never known for smooth-talking diplomacy. Alan once told the scabs on the picket line, the lorry drivers on the picket line, that if they crossed it, then they would never work again in their lifetimes in Birmingham. And that may sound like hyperbole, but I've got to tell you, it was true then. It was definitely true at that moment, at that point. And as Arthur Harper, the president of the AU Birmingham East District Committee, said when he presented the then NUM president, I'm sure Arthur remembers Joe very well, with a pottery figurine of a blacksmith on the first anniversary of Saltley Gate. I was on the bar at the time, so that's why I remember it. He said that it was a gift for all miners, not just for the president of the NUM. At Saltley, he said, we didn't do you a favour, you did us a favour. You united all trades unionists in Birmingham. Never was a truer word spoken. Thanks very much.